Thankfully, PlayStation consoles have historically been a great place to get your hands on retro titles from all corners of the past, and that's never been truer than it is on the PS5, especially considering its compatibility with everything on the PS4. And most of these ports have additional content, like trophies, leaderboards, and various visual enhancements. Also, playing them this way is legal. Now, PlayStation doesn't do a particularly good job of advertising their older titles, but I'm more than happy to pick up the slack and shed some light on some retro titles on the platform that I think are worth playing and will still give you plenty to do in between Spider-Man games and remasters of The Last of Us and whatever this is. I've talked about Rabio Lepus before as a fantastic hidden gem on the PC Engine, but little did I know until fairly recently that via the arcade archives, the game is playable on the PS5 as well. As a port of the original arcade version, I've definitely spotted a few differences here and there from its PC Engine counterpart, but overall, it's almost exactly the same game, which I think is a testament to how well that PC Engine version was handled. This is a massively underrated 2D shoot-'em-up that really deserves more attention than it seems to get. Rabio here is some sort of cyborg rabbit thing, and he's on a mission to rescue the kidnapped royal family and obliterate the legions of strange creatures that are apparently in the way, collecting missiles, carrots, of course, and other things along the way. The missiles turn out to be a hugely important part, as launching them in addition to your regular fire can turn the tide in overwhelming situations, and even make short work of bosses if you don't feel like actually learning how to defeat them properly. Though you are better off learning how to master them because you'll have to fight them all again back to back during the boss rush section at the end. Carrots, as you probably imagine, do restore a little bit of health, but not much. And you're gonna need to hang on to every little bit that you can because Rabio Lepus is a surprisingly challenging game that puts up a lot more of a fight than you might think it would if you're judging it by how it looks. Rabio's regular fire doesn't change throughout the game, which is a little disappointing, but in addition to the missiles, he also has a punch that he can throw when close enough to an enemy or one of these canister things. I'm not entirely sure what the advantage of this is over just continuing to shoot, but it does seem to create kind of a knockback effect on some things, so maybe that's the point. As you can see, this is a bright and colorful shoot-'em-up that arguably fits in the cute-'em-up category. But not every level or enemy feels like it belongs in that mold. Some levels are rather ominous, and many of the enemies are downright disturbing, so aesthetically it's kind of a strange mix of the vaguely cute and the vaguely sinister, and I like that. The bosses embody this perhaps more than anything else, with this adorable little weird ghost guy, to whatever in God's name this horrible thing is supposed to be, and lots of stuff in between. As with every other game under the Arcade Archives umbrella, there's a good amount of options to tinker with that can tweak the experience to your liking. I'm not a big fan of the UI that they use for all this, but it gets the job done, I guess. What Rabio Lepus lacks in weapon variety, I think it vastly overcompensates for with the sheer amount of diversity of enemies, level designs, and hazard types that you're going to be confronted with on a constant basis. Levels don't overstay their welcome, and bosses go down not too long after you've figured out how to beat them, so that excellent sense of pacing and variety pretty much ensure that the game won't get boring or repetitive too quickly. I pretty much always play this game all the way through every time I start it, which isn't something I can often say about any game. This is a really fun shmup that I always recommend any chance I can. Whether you play it on the PC Engine, or here, or somewhere else, just make sure that you do if you're a fan of these types of games. This is a must-play for old-school shooter fans, and it's a card-carrying hidden gem for sure. Medieval is a no-brainer for any fan of old-school PS1-era action-adventure games, like myself, and it's easily one of my all-time favorites. The original game sold quite well for the time, hitting over 800,000 units sold in a little over a year, which, back in 1998, meant the game was a success. Sluggish sales for the sequel and the two remakes of that original game have likely put the Medieval franchise to rest for the time being, but thankfully the majority of the franchise is easily playable right now on your PS5. The action in Medieval is exceedingly simple. It doesn't require you to lock onto enemies and memorize their every move and dodge and parry their attacks for 20 minutes just to defeat them. No, the combat here is on the complete opposite end of that spectrum, with a decidedly loose feel for the melee weapons, and just a little green light to indicate where your projectiles are going to go, which I think works fine for what the game is, but I understand if it's not everybody's cup of tea in 2024 or 5 or whenever you're watching this video. Though you gotta admit, waving giant swords and clubs around wildly while you trade barbs with enemies is amusing, at least. And by the end of the game, Sir Dan's rather large and diverse assortment of weapons becomes one of my favorites from any game, certainly from the PS1 era. You get multiple swords, bows, throwing knives, spears, chicken drumsticks, which turn enemies into literal chickens that you can eat for a little bit of health. And my personal favorite, the Warhammer, round things out nicely and give you more than a couple of options for basically any situation. What's more, revisiting old levels with newly acquired weapons can reveal new areas and secret items, which is something I really like about Medieval. The levels here are so diverse and well designed and fun to complete that revisiting them with new abilities and discovering new things about them is just really enjoyable, and I think that adds a lot of depth to the game. How thoroughly you play the game can also determine the ending, since whether or not you collect every chalice in the game will determine that, which you're definitely going to want to do since that's also how you visit the Hall of Heroes and get new weapons.
Not that there's anything clever about shooting someone in the eye, sir.
So overall, I'd say this is a very impressive game considering it came out on the same system as the Crow City of Angels, and not even that much later. Thankfully, if you own a PS5, you've got a couple of ways to play Medieval. You can simply buy it a la carte on the PSN store, which if you bought it way back on the PS3, like I did, you should be able to just download it for free here and play it with the PS5's fancy PS1 emulator, which gives you the ability to rewind gameplay, save states, and even its own list of PSN trophies to hunt down, which is pretty cool. Alternatively, you could just buy the 2019 remake that developer Other Ocean put together for the PS4, which runs fantastically on the PS5 and is arguably the best way to experience the game due to the extremely well done overhaul of the visuals and the updated controls that offer a lot of modern stuff like being able to control the camera with the right joystick, for instance. Plus, the remake does contain that original PS1 game that you can unlock by accomplishing all the little tasks that these lost souls give you in each level. So this is probably the way I would recommend most people play Medieval, since you get both games in one package, and you might just find that you prefer the remake anyway. Medieval Resurrection, the PSP remake/reimagining that originally launched on PSP back in 2005, is also on the PS5, and also should be free if you purchased it digitally on the PSP or the Vita.
Real shiny stabby sword.
Here you've got the same emulation bells and whistles the PS5 gives PS1 games, and that definitely makes this the best way to play it. That said, as I've gotten older, I like this version of Medieval less and less. The way they made all the characters about 10 times sillier than the original doesn't land with me at all, and the new characters that they've added only subtract from the overall experience. It's definitely a good-looking PSP game and arguably does play better than the PS1 original with strafing and lock-on and a couple other little things added in. But overall, I still think the original or Other Ocean's remake are superior ways to experience this game. Though if you are a die-hard fan of the series and want to play everything in it, it's not like a bad game in an objective way, it's just my least favorite one, and I certainly prefer having the option to play it here than not. Though this all does leave me wondering what the plans are for Medieval 2. The PS5 has all 3 versions of the original game, but not a single way to play Medieval 2, which seems like a strange omission at this point. But outside of that, I'm pretty pleased with how Sony has kept this original game playable in at least one form on pretty much all their platforms. Cubite and Pico Interactive have made a bit of a name for themselves, at least with me, with the way that they port over obscure 16-bit titles to modern platforms. We've gotten games like Zero Tolerance, The Immortal, and several others from them in this modern form, but for the moment, I want to focus on their port of Tinhead from the Sega Genesis, a game that I do enjoy and recommend, even though it makes me want to pull my hair out sometimes. At first, Tinhead seems like little more than yet another Sonic the Hedgehog knockoff that fails to recreate or innovate on any of the things that actually made Sonic fun, and thus just kind of fades into the background. And yeah, it is kind of that. But if you give it a little bit of time, you'll also see that it has a lot more going on than just the typical mascot platformer tropes. For instance, Tinhead is technically kind of a shooter, and a pretty competent one at that. You can shoot in 3 different directions, diagonally up, straight ahead, or you can lob your shots downward, where they roll around until they either hit an enemy or fall off screen. And you switch your firing direction manually with a separate button press, which feels a little bit clunky, especially when you need to quickly switch between them, but you can get used to it. And once you do, it's actually pretty fun approaching different enemies in different ways and finding what works best. Bullets even ricochet off of walls and ceilings, so you can sometimes hit enemies that seem out of range. You can also upgrade the amount of shots Tinhead can pop out in quick succession by collecting these numbers here and adding them to your little numbers there. So Tinhead's combat is actually pretty neat and stands apart from the typical bopping enemies on the head that you normally see in platformers like this. In fact, I kind of wish they had just leaned into that and refined it a little bit more, and left all the ramps and launch pads and other blatantly Sonic things at the door. Tinhead is also a rather good-looking game for a Genesis title. It's not going to blow your mind, but I think the graphics are quite nice throughout. Levels are cool-looking with lots of detail and scrolling layers in the background that add a little bit of depth, and while the levels are colorful and vivid, they're not overwhelming or obnoxious, like some other European platformers from the time that I could mention. I also like the character designs quite a bit, enemies, bosses, and especially Tinhead himself. He's definitely got a neat look and vibe to him that puts him somewhere between Sonic and Bob, and I like him as a character. Had this game sold a little bit better and maybe gotten a sequel, who knows where he could have ended up. Tinhead doesn't fare as well in the sound department though. The music is alright, but largely forgettable. Plus, you spend so much time in each world with several fully fledged stages before you finally get to hear any new music that whatever charm the songs manage to start out with is pretty much spent by the time you actually get to hear something new. How long these levels go on makes the 2 acts of each Sonic stage seem like nothing. Jumping is also super wonky in this game, as Tinhead's jumps seem to lose almost all of their momentum at their high point for no real reason, making it kind of difficult to gauge what you can reach until you get used to that. Even more annoyingly, his jumps automatically repeat if you're still holding onto the jump button when he lands, which is not a good mix with the fact that you have to hold it down for a long press to get the big jump distance, which you almost always need. So you often have to deal with this very short window between holding the jump button down long enough to get the big jump, but not so long as to trigger the turbo jump, which makes the many precise platforming sections in this game much more of a headache than they need to be. Tinhead is also no stranger to the occasional cheap hit, with some enemies flying straight at you from off-screen and giving you less than a microsecond to react. And things like this chemical plant zone speed tunnel thing, sending you straight into spikes, for no reason. So that's fun. Cubyte's retro game packages tend to include sequels or alternative versions of the games that they're porting over, and in Tinhead's case, they seem to have included what I think is an unfinished Atari Jaguar port of the game, but I'm not sure, and I'm completely flabbergasted by how bad it is. Somehow the frame rate is worse, the music seems to be clipping almost constantly, and it just looks darker and not as appealing as the original. They did rework the controls so that Tinhead's 3 firing directions are mapped to separate buttons, which is a neat idea, but outside of that, this is an objectively inferior way to play the game that I recommend just ignoring altogether. Why not just include a toggle for the new control style on the original game and call it a day? Also, isn't there a Super Nintendo version of this game? Why not include that instead? I don't know. That aside, I actually really like how they handled this game. You got your save states, remappable controls, and a few video filters that, while I don't really mess with them, they are pretty good. The CRT one in particular is really cool, although I can't imagine actually playing the game like this. Tinhead's graphics are well done, and naturally just kind of hold up better on a modern screen than you might think, so I just leave them alone. Despite its flaws, something about Tinhead just draws me in. The levels are increasingly large and explorable, and the enemy roster has a lot of good variety, including the gigantic bosses. It is a challenging platformer though, and sometimes does feel like it's not well made enough to really justify the level of dedication it requires. And some of the platforming sections make me want to tear my skin off and shove my head into a waffle iron, but I don't know, I still like it. And I think if you're like me and you're willing to look past some flaws to get to the good stuff, Tinhead is a game that I can definitely recommend, especially if you see it on sale for a couple of bucks, which it often is. Killzone Liberation is a bit of an oddity for the series. 5 of the 6 Killzone games that currently exist are first-person shooters, and I really like all of them, especially 2 and 3, but Liberation goes in a completely different direction as an isometric action game with sort of a tactical streak running through it. This makes the gameplay completely different from the others, and honestly I'm still not sure if I like the direction that it went in or not. It's not a bad game by any means, but I also wouldn't quite call it a particularly great one. I'm very conflicted about it. On one hand, as a PSP game, I give Liberation a lot of credit for wisely sidestepping a lot of the limitations of that platform, which it did by switching up the gameplay like this. The PSP is not known as a great place to play first or third person shooters, as the ones that it did get usually suffer in one way or another. So Killzone Liberation pretty much avoids all of that, and at the same time does a reasonably good job at what it is trying to do. It also takes some respectable stabs at keeping objectives mixed up, with escort missions, tank sections, and some other things that largely play fine. When you get close up on certain things, you can see a certain level of muddiness, but for the most part I think it's a good-looking PSP game and definitely looks like a Killzone game.
Point me at it, Captain.
The dramatic orchestral soundtrack also adds a lot of credibility to it being a legitimate part of the series, especially if you keep in mind that this game came out well before Killzone 2 and only really had the concepts of that original PS2 game to build on. And while I'm not a big fan of strategy games in general, I do dig the ability to command squad members to go to certain spots and attack certain enemies on your behalf. It's not a deep tactical experience, but it does give you some flexibility when approaching different situations, and I think that adds a little something special to the game. Kinda like how Medal of Honor European Assault sort of dabbles in that, but doesn't really dive all the way in. On the other hand, Killzone Liberation has a few glaring flaws that create a bit of a low ceiling for it. For one, several of its mechanics seem half-baked at best. Stealth is supposedly a thing here, but I rarely ever notice any opportunities to actually use it outside of the moments that seem designed around it. Usually enemies just detect you at some point, and almost every encounter turns into a standard shootout before you're able to accomplish much of anything undetected. Why even have stealth at this point? I don't know. Strafing is also finicky at best. You have to be locked onto an enemy to use it, and moving around too much will unlock you from that target, thus removing your ability to circle around them. And it's really unclear where that boundary is. Not sure what the solution to this would have been given the limited buttons of the PSP, but surely something other than this could have been done. That said, if you learn to avoid these little bugaboos, you can have a good amount of fun with Killzone Liberation and enjoy it for what it is. It doesn't stay as explosively entertaining as the other games in the series, but then again it's clearly meant to be played on a portable system in short bursts. And if you keep that in mind, I think you can enjoy your time with it. The only time I wouldn't really recommend it is if you're looking for a good shooter from the PSP library. I'd probably recommend Resistance Retribution or even the Third Birthday before this, if that's what you're looking for. But if you know what you're getting into, I think there's a good amount of fun to be had here. Quake 1 and 2 are available on the PS5, and boy do I love these versions of these games. These are classic arena-style boomer shooters that are just plain fun, no BS. These games are great companions to the original Doom games from the same era, as they're basically just extensions of those same principles. Hyper-violent shooting, lots of movement, and large explorable areas. id Software pretty much invented this genre, and continued to dominate it well into the late 90s with games like this in the PC space. Quake was seen as a big step up in its time, with enemies being made of truly 3D polygonal figures, and not just 2D images moving around in a 3D space like a lot of the first-person shooters before. Music and sound effects were also a huge upgrade for the time. console versions of these games have been hamstrung in one way or another for decades, but now, with these newest versions, those limitations couldn't be any more obliterated, and we now have the best versions of Quake 1 and 2 to ever hit a console, and I can't recommend them enough. The gameplay is every bit as tight and refined as you would expect, with the additional benefit of some console-friendly tweaks to the UI and controls to make these games finally feel at home on a console. The PS5 version in particular gives you native 4K resolution and 120 frames per second, which is quite nice. That's not absolutely necessary, of course, but it definitely makes the games feel even more responsive, which is always welcome. There's also online modes that always seem to have at least a few people in it, so that's kinda cool if you want it. On top of playing and looking better than ever, including tons of additional content and expanding the suite of visual and gameplay options, these particular versions of Quake 1 and 2 have an extremely interesting and, dare I say, innovative integration of the DualSense's gyroscope, allowing you to tilt the controller around to more finely tune your aiming. It takes a little while to get used to, but I find this to be a really creative and effective middle ground between the precision of mouse and keyboard and the comparatively clunkier feel of just using thumbsticks. Although you can always turn it off if you don't like it. The games play fine either way. You can get these games separately or together in a bundle, which is definitely the way to go, I think. And like the other games I've mentioned, these games are very cheap and often on sale for even cheaper. So of course, that's just a really small sampling of all the retro games available on PS5. There's so many that I really don't think I'm ever gonna get around to covering them all. I probably won't even get to cover half of them. And if you're always looking for more retro games to play on modern hardware, like I am, feel free to check out any number of my other videos on the topic. I have several at this point. And of course, feel free to put your own recommendations down in the comments. Since I've pretty much decided I'm gonna be skipping the PS5 Pro, I do want to squeeze as much value out of this console as I possibly can over the next few years, so, I'm always open to discovering something new. Or old. You know what I mean.